He was in full asystole, no heartbeat, no blood pressure, no neurological activity by any monitor attached to him, when he described what happened next. Not what he saw during the ambush. Not what he felt when the RPG hit the vehicle 30 feet to his left. What he described was what happened inside the field hospital tent while the trauma team was working to save him. He described the position of Captain Reyes's body as he talked into the radio. He said Reyes was holding the handset in his left hand, not his right, left. He said a second physician entered the tent and looked at the monitors first before he looked at the patient. He said the time on the clock above the door read 14:12. Captain Reyes confirmed all of it. He confirmed he had been holding the radio in his left hand. Unusual for him, his right arm was cramped from the previous hour's work. He confirmed the second doctor's sequence. Monitors, then patient. He confirmed the clock. He was Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, 31 years old, infantry, 3rd rotation in Kunar Province. He had just bled out from shrapnel to his lower abdomen and right lung. His heart had been in a systole for 6 minutes and 14 seconds before they got him back. What he described about those 6 minutes is what I want to tell you about. Because it's not what you'd expect from a man who went to Afghanistan 3 times and doesn't use words like spiritual for anything. Marcus Webb had been in the army for 9 years when the ambush happened. 3rd rotation, Kunar Province, eastern Afghanistan. He'd been in firefights before, the kind of thing that becomes part of a person's baseline after enough time. He was good at his job, the kind of soldier who noticed things other people missed, who made decisions under pressure that he could justify later in a debrief without his hands shaking. The ambush lasted 11 minutes. An RPG hit the vehicle 30 feet to his left. The blast wave hit him first. By the time the medic reached him, he had a penetrating abdominal wound from shrapnel and internal hemorrhage that would have been fatal without immediate intervention. He was medevaxed to the field hospital in approximately 8 minutes. That's fast. That's the difference between the casualty that lives and the one that doesn't. In the trauma bay, heart rate dropping, blood pressure non-existent by the time they had him on the table. Glasgow coma scale of 6 on arrival, dropping fast. 2 minutes after he reached the table, ventricular fibrillation. Then a systole. The trauma team ran the protocol. Fluids, vasopressors, compressions. They defibrillated twice. On the 3rd defibrillation, at 6 minutes and 14 seconds of a systole, they got a sinus rhythm back. He survived. 3 weeks in the military hospital system before he was stable enough to transfer stateside. 4 months of physical rehabilitation. And then the long part, the part that doesn't have a discharge date. During all of this, he didn't tell anyone what he had experienced during those 6 minutes. He told me almost a year after the ambush. In the veteran support group I attended at a VA facility in Portland, he sat in a folding chair in a fluorescent lit room and said it the way people say things they've been carrying alone for a long time. Not dramatically, just, here it is, take it if you can. The first thing he noticed was that the pain stopped. Not gradually, not fading. One moment the pain was everything, the kind of pain that takes up all available space inside you. And then it wasn't there, like a door closing. He said he was above the table, looking down. He could see his own body from above, and he described it with the precision you'd expect from a man who makes his living in the specific. The wound, the positions of the trauma team, the instruments he could see laid out. He described the way Captain Reyes was crouching slightly to the left of the table because the overhead light was at an angle. He said there was blood on the floor near the left side of the table that nobody had stepped in yet. He said a bag of plasma was running low, almost empty, and the medic hadn't noticed. Then he was somewhere else. He didn't describe a tunnel. He described something more like a transition in weather, the way the air feels different before and after a storm, but the storm itself passes in a single breath. One instant, the field hospital, the monitors, the smell of antiseptic and blood. Next instant, open space. Light that didn't come from above. It came from everywhere. Temperature even. Not warm, not cool. Just present. He said there was no wind and no silence, which sounds like a contradiction, but he said it wasn't. It was more like stillness with weight. And then he saw them. 7 soldiers. He knew all their faces. He would know those faces, he said, for the rest of whatever time he has. He'd lost men before this ambush, across 3 separate incidents in 2 previous rotations. 7 total, over 9 years of combat deployments. Different circumstances, different places. He had carried each of them the way soldiers carry their dead, professionally during the immediate aftermath, and then privately, forever after. They were standing. That was the first thing. Not as he had last seen any of them. Not bloody, not broken, not in the particular posture of each specific death he had memorized. Because you do memorize it, you have to be able to give a report. They were standing the way they'd looked in the ordinary moments. Fatigues, at ease, like they were waiting for a briefing that wasn't going to be about anything hard. He said there was no accusation in any of their faces. He'd been carrying the weight of that, the accusation he'd assigned them in his own head, the version where each death was a failure he owned. He had carried it so long it had become structural, like a bone. He had assumed, without examining the assumption, that they blamed him, that if he ever had to face them, they would want to know why. They didn't. The feeling coming off them, and he paused for a long time before he found the word, was something close to ease. Not relief, not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implies a wrong that needed correcting, more like, we're okay. We were always going to be okay. That part you've been holding, you can put it down. One of them stepped forward. Corporal Danny Figueroa, 22 years old, killed 8 months before this ambush when a vehicle Marcus had signed off on for a route clearance mission hit an IED. Marcus had reviewed the intelligence. He had made the call. He had made the right call by every available data point, and Figueroa had died anyway, and Marcus had never found a way to make those 2 facts coexist in his chest. Figueroa said something to him. Marcus was careful about this when he told me, said he couldn't describe it as words the way words work. It was more like understanding arriving. But what arrived was specific enough that Marcus could repeat it to me later, in a language I could hold. Figueroa said, "You remembered the dogs." Marcus told me he hadn't thought about those dogs in months. Early in the first rotation, he'd started leaving rations outside the base perimeter for the stray dogs that worked the area. It was against regulation. He did it anyway. Figueroa had found out and started doing it too, quietly, and they had never talked about it directly, just a nod once, a shared understanding of something they were both doing that served no tactical purpose and made them feel, briefly, like themselves. You remembered the dogs, not you were a good commander, not you made the right call, not I forgive you, just I see who you actually are. And what I see is not what you've been trying to be forgiven for. He didn't know how much time passed. He said the question of time didn't exist there in a way that allowed for measurement. He knew at some point that he was being returned. He said he didn't feel resistance. He would have stayed, and he knew he'd stay if it were a choice. But it wasn't a choice. Something was pulling him back with the specificity of purpose. Not random retrieval, direction. He came back on the 3rd defibrillation at 6 minutes and 14 seconds. Now let me tell you what makes this account hard to set aside. It's not the emotional content. People in emotional distress produce emotionally significant visions. That's a known pathway. It's not the out-of-body experience itself. There are materialist models that attempt to account for that. Hypoxic brain activity, anesthesia emergence, REM intrusion. Those models exist, and clinicians like me were trained on them. It's the specifics. Captain Reyes holding the radio in his left hand. The medic who hadn't noticed the plasma bag running low. The time on the clock. The second physician's sequence of actions. Monitors, then patient. Marcus Webb was in a systole. No cardiac output, no cerebral blood flow by conventional measures. when he reported observing those details from above the table. Captain Reyes confirmed each one independently. There's a body of research that makes this pattern difficult to dismiss. Dr. Penny Sartori spent years as an ICU nurse at a hospital in Wales before returning to academic research to conduct what became one of the few genuinely prospective near-death experience studies in the medical literature. Prospective means she wasn't collecting retrospective accounts from people who volunteered their stories years later. She was monitoring ICU patients before cardiac arrest, tracking them through the event, and interviewing them immediately after. Over 5 years, approximately 18% of cardiac arrest survivors in her cohort reported near-death experiences. In a subset of those cases, patients reported perceptions during unconsciousness that were later verified by clinical staff. In one documented case, one of the most striking in her research, a patient with a lifelong hand contracture from cerebral palsy reported an out-of-body experience and accurately described the clinical team's positions and actions during his arrest. In the days following, the hand that had been contracted since birth began to open. Sartori documented both the corroborated perceptions and the physical change. Her conclusion was not supernatural. It was scientific. The existing neurological models cannot account for the pattern of what her patients reported. The data does not fit the dominant framework. That's not a fringe claim. That's a researcher with a 5-year prospective dataset saying, the current model has a problem. For Marcus's case, the radio in Reyes's left hand, the time on the clock, the plasma bag, researchers use the term veridical perception. Perception that can be verified against external reality. The brain, during asystole, does not produce veridical perception of events occurring in the room, not by any model we currently hold, which leaves the question open. And the question being open is, I would argue, more honest than the answer we have been filing in charts for 30 years. Here's one more piece of data that belongs here. Survey research from the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation suggests that more than a third of combat veterans who came close to death in theater report experiences consistent with near-death experience criteria. And according to researchers who work with veterans programs, many of them don't report it. Not because they don't know it happened, because when they do report it, one of two things tends to happen. It gets ignored, or it gets flagged as something else entirely. One soldier in a documented account said that the moment he told his nurse what he'd experienced, he was sedated for 3 days and referred for psychiatric evaluation. He was not having a psychotic episode. He was trying to describe what happened to him while his heart stopped. That gap between experience and reception is where a lot of veterans spend years alone. Marcus didn't get to be believed right away either. When he finally told the VA counselor months after the ambush, during a session nominally focused on his PTSD symptoms, the counselor wrote it down and referred him for a psychiatric evaluation. He was not sedated, but the referral was clear. This falls outside the scope of trauma processing. This goes somewhere else. He called that referral one of the loneliest moments of the whole experience. Not the ambush, not the 6 minutes. The fluorescent room where he had finally said it out loud and watched it be categorized as something requiring a different specialist. I understand that loneliness. Not from a combat zone, from a very different kind of hallway. After my own experience, after I woke up from that operating table, knowing what the anesthesiologist had said while my heart wasn't beating, after I confirmed those words and watched his face and understood that there was no model in my training that explained what I was reporting, I made the mistake of telling people too quickly. My colleagues were professional about it. That's almost worse than open skepticism. The professional kindness of people who have decided you've been through something traumatic and need space. My shift assignments changed without an explanation that was ever given. The charge nurse mentioned gently that I seemed tired. My husband sat at the kitchen table the night I told him everything, and he listened, and he didn't sleep for 3 days, and he never brought it up again. Not once. I had experienced something that had shifted every anchor point I was using to make sense of the world, and the world I came back to had no room in it for what I was describing. For a while I thought that isolation was the price, that this was what it cost to know what I now knew, that you paid for the door opening with years of standing on the other side of it, alone. What helped was not someone explaining it to me. What helped was sitting in rooms with other people who had come back from the same edge and found the same world waiting, a world without a map for what they had seen. If you're a veteran watching this, and something happened to you in a field hospital or on a medevac or in a moment on the ground when everything stopped, I'm not asking you to call it spiritual. I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I'm just asking you to know that what more than a third of combat veterans' near-death report is not psychosis. It is not PTSD. It is not a dissociative response to trauma. It is something the research cannot yet fully explain, and something you do not have to explain either. You are allowed to just let it be what it was. Marcus told me, before the group meeting ended, that the thing that had changed for him wasn't his belief about the afterlife. It was the weight. He said the 7 soldiers he couldn't save had looked at him with the same thing written on every face. Not accusation, not disappointment, not even grief. Just, "We're good. We've got you. Go back." He said for 3 years he'd been walking around trying to earn forgiveness from people who weren't waiting to give it, because they didn't need to, because there was nothing to forgive, because wherever they were okay. They knew he'd done what he could with what he had, and the only person still running the trial was him. He said putting that weight down felt like being able to breathe again, really breathe. After 3 years of breathing, just enough to keep going. I've thought about what he said every time I've sat with someone carrying something they can't put down. The guilt that becomes structural. The version of the dead that lives inside you and never stops accusing. The evidence you keep preparing for a jury that isn't there. I don't know what was in the space where Marcus's heart stopped for 6 minutes. I don't know if it was Danny Figueroa or something Marcus needed Danny Figueroa to be. I don't have a clinical framework that settles the question. What I know is that Marcus Webb came back from Asistole with knowledge he shouldn't have been able to possess, and a weight he had carried for 3 years was no longer in his hands. I'll leave the explanation to the researchers. The weight being gone is real enough for me.